The smell of burning rubber filled my nostrils as I stood in my driveway, watching Margaret Patterson march across the street toward my property like she was leading a crusade against Satan himself. I'd been living in Greenfield, Colorado for 3 years now, and in that time, Margaret had made it her personal mission to make my life miserable. But this morning, she looked especially determined, her phone already pressed against her ear as she gestured wildly at my front yard. "Yes, officer, I need someone here immediately," she barked into the phone, her voice carrying across the quiet suburban street. "There's an illegal structure in our community that violates multiple HOA regulations and probably city codes too." I set down my coffee mug on the porch railing and crossed my arms, waiting. "My name is Lucas Harrington, and I'm a sculptor by trade. Not the kind that makes abstract pieces for stuffy galleries, though I've done some of that. I specialize in ice sculptures, which is why my front yard currently featured 3 elaborate frozen masterpieces that I'd been working on for the past week. They were for a wedding in Denver next weekend, and I needed to photograph them in natural lighting for my portfolio." "Margaret," I called out, keeping my voice level. "What seems to be the problem?" She whirled on me, her highlighted blonde bob swinging dramatically. "The problem, Lucas, is that you've turned this respectable neighborhood into some kind of circus attraction. Do you have any idea how many cars have driven by slowly this morning? You're creating a traffic hazard." "People appreciating art isn't a traffic hazard," I replied calmly. "And I checked the HOA rules before setting these up. There's nothing about temporary art installations." "Temporary." Her laugh was shrill enough to make the neighbor's dog start barking. "You've had these monstrosities out here for 3 days already. The HOA bylaws clearly state that no resident may erect any structure, permanent or temporary, without written approval from the board." I took a sip of my coffee, enjoying the fact that I knew something she didn't. "Margaret, these sculptures are on my property, my private property, not HOA land." Her face flushed red, a color I'd become intimately familiar with over the past 3 years. "That's ridiculous. Everyone's front yard is subject to HOA regulations. That's what we all agreed to when we bought our homes." Before I could respond, a Greenfield Police Department cruiser pulled up to the curb. Officer Ryan stepped out, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. This wasn't the first time Margaret had called the cops on me, and I was pretty sure Ryan had drawn the short straw again. "Morning, Lucas." "Margaret?" He nodded to both of us, adjusting his belt. "Got a call about some kind of structure violation." Margaret immediately launched into her complaint, gesturing at my ice sculptures like they were offensive monuments. I'd created 3 pieces: a life-sized eagle with its wings spread, an abstract geometric tower that stood about 8 feet tall, and a detailed rendering of the Colorado State Capitol building. They were some of my best work, and I was proud of them. "These have been here for days," Margaret insisted. "They're attracting unwanted attention, they're probably melting all over everything, and they violate our community standards. I want them removed immediately." Officer Ryan walked over to examine the sculptures more closely, his boots crunching on the frozen ground. It was early February, and the temperature hadn't been above freezing all week, which was perfect for my work. He pulled out his phone and took a few pictures, probably for a report he'd have to file later. "These are impressive," he said, and I caught the hint of a smile on his face. "You make these yourself, Lucas?" "I did. They're for a client in Denver. I needed to photograph them in natural light, and since it's been cold enough, I figured I'd set them up out here rather than keeping them in my workshop freezer." Officer Ryan turned to Margaret. "What exactly is the violation you're reporting?" "HOA bylaws prohibit any structures without board approval," she said, pulling out her own phone. She scrolled through it frantically. Section 7. Subsection 3 clearly states that no homeowner may place any permanent or temporary structure in their yard without written consent from the Architectural Review Committee. And do these sculptures fall under that definition? Ryan asked. Obviously. Margaret's voice was reaching that pitch that suggested she was about to demand to speak to someone's supervisor. They're structures, they're in his yard, and he didn't get approval. I set my coffee down again and pulled out my phone. Officer, if you don't mind, I'd like to show you something. I opened up the document I'd saved specifically for this moment, knowing it would eventually come. This is the official property survey I had done last year. You'll notice that my property line actually extends 15 feet beyond where the HOA claims it does. Margaret's face went from red to pale. That's impossible. It's not only possible, it's documented with the county. I zoomed in on the relevant section. When this neighborhood was developed, my lot was part of a larger parcel that was subdivided. The developer made an error in the original HOA mapping, but my deed is clear. Everything from my house to that line of stakes I installed last spring is private property, not subject to HOA regulations. I discovered this little fact about 6 months ago when I was considering putting in a fence. The surveyor I'd hired had been the one to point out the discrepancy, and I'd immediately filed the correct boundaries with the county. I hadn't advertised the fact because I knew it would cause drama, but I also wasn't going to let the HOA tell me what I could do on my own land. Officer Ryan examined my phone screen carefully, then looked at Margaret. Madam, if his property survey shows that these sculptures are on private land outside HOA jurisdiction, then there's no violation for me to enforce. But that can't be right, Margaret sputtered. I've been on the HOA board for 12 years, and I know exactly where everyone's property lines are. With all due respect, Ryan said diplomatically, that's a civil matter between Mr. Harrington and the HOA. If you believe there's an error in the property boundaries, you'll need to take that up through proper legal channels. As for a criminal violation or city code issue, I don't see one here. Margaret's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. You're just going to leave. You're not going to make him remove those eyesores. They're art, madam, and they're on his property. No law against that. Ryan tipped his hat to me. Have a good day, Lucas. Those really are impressive. As the officer drove away, I expected Margaret to retreat and regroup. Instead, she stood her ground, her hands on her hips, staring at the sculptures like they'd personally insulted her family. This isn't over, she said quietly. I don't care what your fancy survey says. You're part of this HOA and you'll follow the rules like everyone else. The rules that apply to HOA property, I corrected, which this isn't. She turned and marched back across the street without another word, but I could see her pulling out her phone again before she even reached her own driveway. I knew what was coming next. Margaret wasn't just a resident on the HOA board. She was the president, and she wielded that position like a medieval warlord wielding a sword. I went back inside to warm up my coffee and check my email. Sure enough, within 20 minutes, I had a message from the HOA attorney, Gerald Simmons. It was a formal letter demanding that I provide proof of my property boundaries and threatening legal action if the sculptures weren't removed within 48 hours. I forwarded the email to my own attorney, Sarah Chen, along with a brief explanation of the morning's events. Sarah had handled the property survey paperwork for me and had already reviewed the HOA bylaws. She called me within the hour. "Lucas, I got your forward," she said. "This is exactly what we anticipated might happen. I'll respond to Simmons with copies of the recorded survey and the county records." but I want to give you a heads up that this could get ugly." "How ugly?" Margaret Patterson has a reputation for being, let's say, persistent. I've dealt with her before on other cases. She doesn't like to lose, and she really doesn't like being proven wrong. Even though your legal position is solid, she might try to make your life difficult in other ways. "She's already been doing that for 3 years," I said. "What else can she really do?" "Don't underestimate the creativity of a vindictive HOA president," Sarah warned. "Just keep documenting everything. Every interaction, every email, every phone call. If this escalates, we'll need a paper trail." I spent the rest of the day working on the sculptures, making small refinements and taking photographs from different angles. The eagle was my favorite. I'd spent hours getting the feather detail just right, and in the afternoon sun, the ice caught the light in a way that made it look almost alive. Several neighbors stopped by throughout the day, most of them complimentary. A few mentioned that Margaret had been going door to door, trying to rally support for having my sculptures removed. Tom Fredericks, who lived 3 houses down, stopped by around 4 in the afternoon. He was a retired electrician who'd always been friendly, even if he stayed out of HOA politics. "Those are something else, Lucas," he said, admiring the Capitol building sculpture. "My wife and I have been watching you work on them. Incredible detail." "Thanks, Tom, I appreciate that." He hesitated, then lowered his voice. "Look, I wanted to give you a heads up. Margaret came by earlier, trying to get me to sign a petition demanding the HOA take legal action against you. She's claiming you're lowering property values and creating a dangerous situation." "Dangerous how?" "Something about children being attracted to the ice and potentially getting hurt if a sculpture fell on them." Tom rolled his eyes. "It's nonsense, and most people aren't signing, but she's got a few people convinced that you're some kind of community menace." "Of course she does." I rubbed my eyes, feeling the familiar tension of dealing with HOA drama. "Thanks for the warning, Tom." "No problem. For what it's worth, I think what you're doing is great. This neighborhood could use a little more character instead of everyone having identical beige houses and the exact same landscaping." That evening, I got a call from my client in Denver, asking if the sculptures would be ready for transport by Thursday. I assured her they would be and sent her some of the photos I'd taken. She was thrilled, which made all the hassle with Margaret feel slightly more worthwhile. This commission was going to pay me enough to cover 3 months of expenses, and the exposure from the wedding could lead to more high-end clients. The next morning, I woke up to find that someone had spray-painted eyesore across my driveway in orange paint. The vandalism was crude and obvious, done in the middle of the night when no one would see. I immediately took photos from multiple angles and called the police to file a report. This time, Officer Ryan didn't respond. Instead, I got Officer Jennifer Martinez, who seemed less amused by the situation than Ryan had been. "Any idea who might have done this?" she asked, photographing the graffiti. "I have suspicions, but no proof," I said carefully. "I've been having an ongoing dispute with the HOA president, Margaret Patterson. She's been trying to force me to remove my ice sculptures." "The ones in your yard," Martinez looked over at them. "Those are pretty cool, pun intended." "Thanks." Yesterday, she called the police claiming they were illegal structures. When that didn't work, she had the HOA attorney threaten legal action. Last night, someone did this. "You think she did it?" "I think someone who's upset about the sculptures did it, but like I said, I have no proof." I wasn't about to directly accuse Margaret without evidence, even though every instinct I had pointed to her or someone she'd convinced to act on her behalf. Martinez took down all the information and gave me a case number for my insurance. I'd recommend getting a security camera if you don't have one already. If this is part of an ongoing harassment situation, you'll want documentation. After she left, I spent 2 hours scrubbing orange paint off my concrete driveway. It didn't all come off, leaving a faint ghost of the word eyesore that would probably be there until spring when I could have it professionally cleaned. By the time I finished, I was cold, frustrated, and more than a little angry. I called Sarah Chen again. "They vandalized your property." Her voice sharpened. "Lucas, this has escalated beyond a simple HOA dispute. Did you file a police report?" "Yes, this morning." "Good. I'm going to send a formal letter to both Margaret Patterson personally and the HOA board as a whole, putting them on notice that any further harassment or vandalism will result in a civil lawsuit. This crosses a line." "You really think Margaret did it herself?" "Doesn't matter if she did it personally or convinced someone else to do it. As the person leading this campaign against you, she's potentially liable either way. We need to make it clear that there will be consequences." That afternoon, I went to a hardware store and bought 2 high-quality security cameras with night vision. I installed one covering my driveway and front yard, and another covering the side of my house, where I kept my workshop entrance. I also bought motion sensor lights and installed them around the perimeter of my property. If someone came back for round 2, I'd have them on video. Around 6 that evening, my doorbell rang. I checked the video feed from my new camera and saw a woman I didn't recognize standing on my porch. She was probably in her 50s, dressed in business casual clothes and carrying a folder. I opened the door cautiously. "Can I help you, Mr. Harrington? My name is Patricia Donnelly. I'm the vice president of the HOA board." She offered her hand, which I shook warily. "I was hoping we could talk for a few minutes. About the sculptures, among other things. May I come in? I promise this isn't an ambush or anything hostile. I actually think we can resolve this situation reasonably." I hesitated, then stepped aside to let her in. Patricia had a much calmer demeanor than Margaret, and she'd always seemed like one of the more rational people at HOA meetings, on the rare occasions I'd attended them. We sat in my living room, and she opened her folder, pulling out several documents. "First, I want to apologize for how Margaret has handled this situation. Her approach has been inappropriate and, frankly, embarrassing for the board. I appreciate that. Second, I've reviewed the property survey you filed with the county, and I've consulted with our attorney independently of Margaret. Your property boundaries are exactly where you claim they are. The error was made during the initial neighborhood development, and it was never caught until now. So the HOA acknowledges that the sculptures are on my private land." "Yes." She pulled out another document. "I've prepared a formal letter from the board that states this clearly. Margaret is not happy about it, but she's been outvoted. The other 3 board members all agree that if the property is outside HOA jurisdiction, then we have no grounds to demand removal of your artwork." I felt some of the tension leave my shoulders. That's a relief to hear. "However," Patricia continued, and I tensed again, "I do need to address a few concerns that other residents have raised, not about the legality of the sculptures, but about practical matters, such as the increased traffic on our street. People have been driving by to look at your work, and some residents are concerned about safety, particularly with children in the neighborhood. The speed limit is 25 miles per hour, and I've seen people driving slowly past decorated houses at Christmas without the HOA complaining." "You're right, and that's exactly the argument I made to the others, but I wanted to make you aware of the concern." She pulled out another paper. "There's also been some worry about the water runoff when the sculptures melt. Mrs. Henderson at the end of the street is worried about flooding." The sculptures are melting into my own yard, on ground that slopes away from all the neighboring properties, and they'll be gone by Thursday anyway. They're going to Denver for a wedding. I understand. I'm just being thorough. Patricia closed her folder and looked at me directly. Lucas, between you and me, Margaret has made this personal, and that's not acceptable. I've tried to keep her in check for years, but she has a tendency to fixate on things. I wanted to come here personally to let you know that not everyone on the board shares her approach. I appreciate you saying that, but someone vandalized my driveway last night and I have a pretty good idea it's related to this whole situation. Her face fell. I heard about that. I'm sorry. For what it's worth, I don't believe Margaret did that personally. Maybe not personally. But if she's been going around the neighborhood telling everyone that I'm destroying property values and creating dangerous conditions, she's creating an environment where someone might think they're doing the community a favor by harassing me. Patricia nodded slowly. That's a fair point. I'll address it at our next board meeting. In the meantime, if you have any further issues, please contact me directly. She handed me a business card. My cell number is on there. Call any time. After she left, I felt slightly better about the situation. At least some people in the HOA leadership were reasonable. But I knew Margaret wasn't going to let this go just because she'd been overruled by the rest of the board. I was right. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of someone yelling outside. I looked out my bedroom window and saw Margaret standing on the sidewalk in front of my house, holding a megaphone. Attention, residents of Pinewood Estates. Her amplified voice echoed through the quiet morning. This is your HOA president, Margaret Patterson. I'm here to remind everyone that we have rules and standards in our community for a reason. I checked my phone. It was 6:30 in the morning. I threw on clothes and hurried outside, where other neighbors were also emerging, looking confused and annoyed. Margaret, what are you doing? I called out. She turned the megaphone toward me. I'm exercising my right to free speech, Lucas. Since you seem to think that rules don't apply to you, I thought I'd remind everyone what kind of precedent that sets. Tom Fredericks came out of his house in a bathrobe. Margaret, it's 6:30 in the morning. Some of us are trying to sleep. Then maybe you should care more about the destruction of our community standards. Margaret shot back through the megaphone. I pulled out my phone and started recording. If she was going to make a scene, I wanted it documented. Several other neighbors had the same idea. Our HOA has rules that we all agreed to follow, Margaret continued. But Lucas Harrington thinks he's special. He thinks he can do whatever he wants without consequences. I'm following the law and my property rights, I said loudly enough for everyone to hear. The HOA board has already acknowledged that my sculptures are on private land. A technicality, Margaret's voice cracked with emotion. A loophole that you're exploiting to undermine everything we've built here. Officer Martinez's cruiser pulled up to the curb, lights flashing. She got out and approached Margaret with a look of professional patience. Madam, I'm going to need you to turn off the megaphone, Martinez said. I'm exercising my constitutional rights. At 6:30 in the morning in a residential neighborhood. That's a noise violation. Turn off the megaphone or I'll have to cite you. For a moment, I thought Margaret might actually refuse. She stood there, megaphone in hand, her face flushed with anger and what looked like tears. Then she lowered it and switched it off. This is harassment, she said to Martinez. He called you to harass me. Actually, we got 3 separate calls about someone using a megaphone in the neighborhood, Martinez replied. And I'm pretty sure Mr. Harrington didn't call any of them, since he was the subject of your speech. Margaret's gaze swept across the gathered neighbors, many of whom were filming with their phones. She seemed to realize that she'd miscalculated badly. This wasn't making her look like a defender of community standards. It was making her look unhinged. "Fine," she said tightly. "But this still isn't over." She marched back to her car and drove off, leaving the rest of us standing in the cold morning air. Officer Martinez approached me. "Mr. Harrington, I'm starting to think you've got a serious harassment problem on your hands." "You think?" "Have you considered getting a restraining order against the HOA president? Wouldn't that be complicated?" "Not if she's harassing you, and based on what I just witnessed, there might be grounds for it." She pulled out a business card. "This is the number for victim services. They can walk you through the process if you decide to pursue it." After everyone dispersed, I went back inside and called Sarah Chen, even though it was barely 7 in the morning. "She did what?" Sarah sounded fully awake despite the early hour. I explained the megaphone incident, including the fact that I had video of the whole thing. "Send me that video right now," Sarah said. "Lucas, this is escalating in a way that concerns me." That's targeted harassment, and combined with the vandalism, we might be looking at a pattern of behavior that crosses legal lines. Martinez suggested I get a restraining order. "That's actually not a bad idea. Let me look into it. In the meantime, I'm going to draft a cease and desist letter that will make it very clear that Margaret Patterson is exposing herself to serious legal liability if she continues this behavior." Thursday morning arrived, and with it came the transport truck to take my sculptures to Denver. The driver was a guy named Mike who I'd worked with before on large installations. He had a refrigerated truck and knew how to handle delicate ice work. "These are some of your best pieces," Mike said as we carefully loaded the Eagle onto the truck. "The detail on the feathers is incredible." "Thanks. It was a labor of love, and a source of way more drama than I'd anticipated, but I didn't mention that part. As we were loading the last sculpture, Margaret appeared again. This time she had a man with her, someone I didn't recognize. He was wearing a suit and carrying a briefcase. "Lucas Harrington," the man called out. "That's me. I'm Gerald Simmons, attorney for the Pinewood Estates HOA. I have a court order here requiring you to cease and desist all commercial activities being conducted from this residence." He handed me a stack of papers. I glanced through them quickly, my heart sinking. It was an emergency injunction filed by the HOA, claiming that I was running an illegal business from my home in violation of the neighborhood's residential zoning. "This is ridiculous," I said. "I have a home office. Lots of people work from home. Not operating commercial manufacturing and transportation operations," Simmons replied smoothly. "The HOA has bylaws prohibiting business activities that create excessive traffic, noise, or other disruptions to the residential character of the neighborhood." Margaret stood behind him, her arms crossed, a look of satisfaction on her face. Mike looked at me uncertainly. "Do I need to unload these?" "No," I said firmly. "This injunction is about future operations, not work that's already completed. These sculptures are going to Denver as planned." Simmons frowned. "Mr. Harrington, I strongly advise you to comply with this order, and I'll have my attorney review it and respond appropriately. But these sculptures are already commissioned work for a client, and they're leaving my property right now." I turned to Mike. "Let's finish loading." We got the last sculpture secured and Mike drove off. I watched the truck disappear down the street, then turned back to Simmons and Margaret. "You'll be hearing from my attorney," I said. "As you'll be hearing from us," Simmons replied. "Any further commercial activities conducted from this property will result in additional legal action and daily fines." After they left, I immediately called Sarah. "They did what?" She sounded furious. "They filed an emergency injunction. On what grounds?" I read her the relevant sections of the court order. She was silent for a moment, and I could hear her typing rapidly. "Okay, this is actually good news," she said finally. "How is this good news? Because they've overreached badly. An emergency injunction requires showing immediate and irreparable harm. What harm is the HOA suffering from you creating sculptures in your private workshop? This is clearly retaliation for you asserting your property rights, and a judge is going to see right through it. So what do we do? I'm going to file an emergency motion to dissolve the injunction. We should be able to get a hearing within a few days. In the meantime, don't do any work that could be construed as commercial activity. No new client projects, no deliveries, nothing that they could use as evidence. My workshop is how I make my living, Sarah. I know, and that's exactly why this injunction is improper, but we need to play this smart. A few days won't kill your business, but giving them ammunition will make our case harder. I spent the next few days feeling like I was under siege in my own home. My new security cameras caught Margaret driving by slowly at least a dozen times, sometimes with Simmons in the passenger seat. Other neighbors told me that the HOA had sent out an email blast warning that illegal business operations were being conducted in the neighborhood and encouraging everyone to report any suspicious activity. The hearing for the injunction was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Sarah assured me that we had a strong case, but I couldn't shake the anxiety. If the judge sided with the HOA, I'd effectively be unable to work from my home, which would destroy my business model. I couldn't afford to rent commercial space, especially not space with the kind of industrial freezers I needed for ice sculpture work. Monday afternoon, something unexpected happened. Patricia Donnelly called me. "Lucas, I need to talk to you about something urgent," she said. "Can we meet somewhere neutral? Not your house, not mine." We agreed to meet at a coffee shop in downtown Greenfield. When I arrived, Patricia was already there, looking stressed and tired. "I'm resigning from the HOA board," she said without preamble, "and I thought you should know why." I sat down across from her. "What happened?" Margaret has completely lost it. After the court hearing was scheduled, she called an emergency board meeting. She wanted us to vote on assessing you thousands of dollars in fines for various alleged violations. When I pointed out that most of what she was claiming were either on your private property or completely fabricated, she accused me of being in league with you. In league with me. Her exact words were that I was part of a conspiracy to destroy the HOA and turn Pinewood Estates into a commercial district. Patricia shook her head. The woman has become obsessed. When I tried to be the voice of reason, she actually moved to have me removed from the board for conflict of interest. Did the others back her up? 2 of them did. They're scared of her, Lucas. She's been on that board for 12 years, and she's built up a lot of power. People who cross her find themselves facing constant violations, harassment, and legal threats. I'm done with it. I submitted my resignation this morning. I'm sorry you're caught up in this. Don't be. I should have stood up to her years ago. Patricia pulled out a folder and slid it across the table. This is everything I could gather about Margaret's activities as HOA president. Financial records, emails, meeting minutes. Some of it is pretty damning. I opened the folder and started leafing through. There were bank statements showing HOA funds being used for questionable purposes, including several payments to Gerald Simmons that seemed excessive. There were emails where Margaret discussed targeting specific homeowners who had crossed her. There were documented instances of her abusing her position to intimidate residents. Why are you giving this to me? Because you're going to need it. Margaret isn't going to stop until either you're driven out of the neighborhood or she's removed from power. And frankly, I think the only way to stop her is to expose what she's been doing. That night, I met with Sarah and showed her Patricia's documents. She went through them carefully, making notes and occasionally taking photos with her phone. "This is a gold mine," she said finally. "There's potential fraud here, abuse of fiduciary duty, and clear evidence of harassment and retaliation. Lucas, this goes way beyond your case. This could bring down the entire HOA board. Is that something we want to do? It might be something we have to do. If Margaret is systematically abusing her position, she needs to be held accountable. And if the HOA itself has been operating improperly, the homeowners have a right to know." The hearing on Tuesday was held at the Jefferson County Courthouse. Sarah and I arrived early, and I was surprised to see several of my neighbors in the courtroom gallery. Tom Fredericks was there, along with a few other people who'd been friendly to me. Sitting on the opposite side of the aisle was Margaret, Gerald Simmons, and two other HOA board members. Judge Andrea Morrison presided. She was a no-nonsense woman in her 60s who'd been on the bench for over 20 years, according to Sarah's research. Simmons presented the HOA's case first, arguing that my ice sculpture business constituted a commercial operation that was disrupting the residential character of Pinewood Estates. He cited the truck traffic, the crowds of people stopping to look at the sculptures, and various noise complaints that had allegedly been filed. When it was Sarah's turn, she systematically dismantled every argument. She showed that my business was a legitimate home office, no different from thousands of other people who worked from home in Colorado. She presented evidence that the excessive traffic consisted of a few neighbors stopping to admire the artwork, and one commercial truck for a single delivery. She demonstrated that the noise complaints were either fabricated or related to Margaret's own megaphone incident. Then she brought up the property survey. "Your Honor, the fundamental issue here is that the HOA has engaged in a pattern of harassment against my client after he asserted his legal property rights. The sculptures that triggered this dispute were located on Mr. Harrington's private land, outside HOA jurisdiction. Rather than accept this fact, the HOA president, Margaret Patterson, has engaged in a campaign of retaliation." Sarah presented the timeline: the initial police call, the vandalism, the megaphone incident, and finally the injunction itself. She showed the judge the video from my security cameras and the social media posts where Margaret had encouraged neighborhood residents to report me for any activities she could construe as violations. This emergency injunction was not filed to protect the HOA or the neighborhood, Sarah concluded. It was filed as retaliation against Mr. Harrington for refusing to bow to Miss Patterson's demands. It's an abuse of the legal system and an improper restriction on my client's ability to earn a living. Judge Morrison looked at Gerald Simmons. "Counselor, do you have any evidence that Mr. Harrington's work activities have caused actual harm to the HOA or its members?" Simmons shuffled his papers. "Your Honor, the concern is about the precedent it sets. If Mr. Harrington is allowed to operate a commercial business from his home, other residents may do the same, and the residential character of the neighborhood will be destroyed." "That's a policy argument, not evidence of harm," the judge said. "Do you have any actual evidence of damage, disruption, or violation of applicable zoning laws? The HOA bylaws clearly prohibit commercial activities. On HOA property, yes. But Mr. Harrington's work is conducted on his private property, which your own attorney's review confirmed is outside HOA jurisdiction." Judge Morrison flipped through her notes. "It seems to me that the HOA is trying to enforce regulations that don't apply to the property in question." "Your Honor, if I may," Margaret stood up from the plaintiff's table, ignoring Simmons's attempt to stop her. This man has been flouting our community standards since he moved in. He's deliberately trying to undermine everything we've built in Pinewood Estates. Miss Patterson, you're not an attorney and you need to let your counsel speak for you. But someone needs to tell you what's really going on here. He's been, Miss Patterson, sit down, or I'll hold you in contempt. Margaret sat, her face red with fury. Judge Morrison looked at both attorneys. I'm dissolving the injunction, effective immediately. The HOA has failed to demonstrate any grounds for emergency relief, and the evidence suggests this action was filed in bad faith as retaliation against Mr. Harrington for asserting his property rights. Mr. Harrington is free to continue his home-based business activities. Your Honor, Simmons started to object, but the judge cut him off. Furthermore, I'm ordering the HOA to pay Mr. Harrington's attorney fees related to this hearing. This was a frivolous action that never should have been filed. We're adjourned. The gavel came down, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Sarah squeezed my shoulder. That was a complete victory, she said quietly. The judge basically called them out for abusing the legal system. As we gathered our materials, Margaret pushed past us, her face twisted with anger. This isn't over, she hissed at me. You think you've won, but you have no idea what's coming. Miss Patterson, I'd be very careful about making threats, Sarah said sharply. Especially after a judge just found that your HOA has been acting in bad faith. Gerald Simmons grabbed Margaret's arm and pulled her away before she could respond. As they left, Tom Fredericks approached me. Lucas, that was something else, he said. A bunch of us have been talking, and we think it's time for some changes in the HOA leadership. What kind of changes? The kind where Margaret Patterson is no longer president. She's been a problem for years, but what she's put you through has opened a lot of people's eyes. We're organizing a special election to recall the board. Over the next 2 weeks, the neighborhood transformed into a political battlefield. Tom and several other residents formed a coalition to recall Margaret and the 2 board members who'd supported her harassment campaign. They gathered signatures, held meetings, and spread the word about Margaret's abuses of power. I tried to stay out of it, focusing on my work. The Denver wedding had been a huge success, and the client had posted photos of my sculptures all over social media. I'd gotten half a dozen inquiries from potential new clients, including a hotel chain interested in having ice sculptures for a corporate event in Aspen. But I couldn't completely avoid the HOA drama. Margaret wasn't going down without a fight. She sent out multiple email blasts claiming that the recall effort was being orchestrated by me as revenge for the HOA enforcing reasonable rules. She organized her own counter-petition and held a rally in the neighborhood park to defend her leadership. The rally was sparsely attended. Only about 15 people showed up, mostly the same longtime residents who'd been Margaret's allies for years. Meanwhile, the recall petition gathered over 100 signatures, well more than the threshold needed to trigger a special election. The election was held on a Saturday in late February at the community center. The turnout was massive, nearly 3/4 of the neighborhood's homeowners. I voted to recall Margaret and the 2 board members who'd supported her, then waited nervously for the results. By early evening, it was over. Margaret and her allies were removed from the board by a margin of nearly 2-1. A new board was elected, including Tom Fredericks as the new president. The first act of the new board was to commission an independent audit of the HOA's finances, using the documents Patricia had provided as a starting point. That audit, completed in March, revealed that Margaret had been systematically misusing HOA funds for years. She'd been billing the HOA for personal legal expenses, paying herself unauthorized bonuses, and using HOA money to harass homeowners she didn't like. The total amount of misappropriated funds was over $50,000. The new HOA board filed a criminal complaint with the Jefferson County District Attorney's Office. In April, Margaret Patterson was arrested and charged with theft, fraud, and abuse of fiduciary duty. Gerald Simmons, the HOA attorney, was also charged as an accessory for his role in facilitating some of the financial irregularities. I watched the local news coverage of Margaret's arrest with mixed feelings. Part of me was satisfied to see her held accountable for her actions. But another part of me felt sad that it had come to this. She'd been so consumed by her need for control and her personal vendetta against me that she destroyed her own life. The criminal case moved slowly through the system. Margaret hired an expensive defense attorney and fought the charges vigorously. But the evidence was overwhelming. In June, facing the prospect of a trial she was likely to lose, she accepted a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to reduced charges and was sentenced to 2 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 1 year. She was also ordered to pay full restitution to the HOA. Gerald Simmons had his law license suspended and was sentenced to 6 months of house arrest and community service. The Bar Association opened its own ethics investigation that would likely result in disbarment. Through all of this, I kept working. My business grew steadily. The publicity from the wedding, combined with the local news coverage of the HOA drama, had given me a profile I never could have bought with advertising. I was getting calls from clients all over Colorado and even a few from neighboring states. In May, I hired an assistant, a young woman named Rachel who was studying sculpture at the University of Colorado. She was talented and eager to learn, and having help allowed me to take on bigger projects. The new HOA board, led by Tom, was a completely different experience from Margaret's regime. They were reasonable, responsive, and focused on actually serving the community rather than controlling it. One of their first actions was to formally recognize my corrected property boundaries and to apologize on behalf of the HOA for the harassment I'd endured. In July, Tom approached me with an interesting proposal. The neighborhood was planning a summer festival, and they wanted to know if I'd be willing to create some ice sculptures as a centerpiece. They offered to pay me for my work and to feature the event as a showcase of local artistic talent. I agreed, and on a hot Saturday in August, I set up a series of sculptures in the community park. I created a fountain made entirely of ice, a series of geometric abstract pieces, and a massive sculpture of the Rocky Mountains. The neighborhood came together for the festival, and for the first time since I'd moved to Pinewood Estates, I felt like I was actually part of a community rather than an outsider under siege. People who'd been cold to me during Margaret's reign now approached me to apologize and to compliment my work. Parents brought their children to see the sculptures and asked me to explain how I created them. Local media covered the event, and the exposure led to even more business opportunities. By September, I'd saved enough money to finally install that fence I'd been thinking about for years. I worked with the new HOA board to make sure the design was appropriate, and they approved it without any hassle. The fence defined my property lines clearly and gave me some additional privacy, which I appreciated after the intensity of the previous months. Patricia Donnelly, the former vice president who'd resigned, stopped by one afternoon while I was working on a new commission in my driveway. She'd moved out of Pinewood Estates shortly after resigning from the board, but she was back visiting friends in the neighborhood. "I heard about everything that happened after I left," she said. "I'm glad you fought back." Margaret needed to be stopped, and I'm sorry I didn't do more to stop her earlier. You did what you could, I said. And the documents you gave me were crucial. They provided the evidence we needed to show the pattern of abuse. I should have spoken up years ago. I knew she was misusing funds. I knew she was targeting people unfairly, but I convinced myself it wasn't my place to rock the boat. I regret that. Well, the boat got rocked anyway, and the neighborhood is better for it, she smiled. It really is. I've been thinking about moving back, actually. Now that there's new leadership and a different culture, Pinewood Estates feels like the community it was supposed to be all along. In October, I got a letter from Margaret. It was forwarded from the county jail where she was serving her sentence. I almost didn't open it, but curiosity got the better of me. The letter was brief and stilted, clearly written under the advice of her attorney or a therapist. She apologized for her actions and acknowledged that she'd been wrong to target me. She explained that she'd been dealing with personal issues, stress, and an unhealthy need for control that had spiraled out of hand. She didn't make excuses, but she asked for my forgiveness. I read the letter twice, then filed it away. I wasn't sure if I forgave her or not. What she'd put me through had been genuinely traumatic, and the stress had affected my work, my sleep, and my overall quality of life for months. But I also recognized that holding on to anger would only hurt me, not her. A few weeks later, I wrote a brief response. I acknowledged her apology and said that I hoped she would get the help she needed to address whatever issues had led her down this path. I didn't say I forgave her, because I wasn't sure that was true yet. But I also didn't say I wouldn't forgive her eventually. I left that door open, for my own peace of mind more than hers. By November, life had settled into a comfortable rhythm. My business was thriving. I had regular clients and a growing reputation as one of the best ice sculptors in Colorado. Rachel had proven to be an excellent assistant, and I was training her in the advanced techniques that had taken me years to develop. The neighborhood had transformed as well. The new HOA board had implemented several changes that made Pinewood Estates a more welcoming and flexible community. They'd relaxed some of the more draconian rules about home appearances, allowing for more individual expression while still maintaining reasonable standards. They'd also implemented better financial controls and transparency, ensuring that what happened under Margaret's leadership could never happen again. In December, I was commissioned to create a series of ice sculptures for a major New Year's Eve event in Denver. It was the biggest project of my career, and it would be featured on local television. As I worked on the designs, I thought about how different my life was from a year ago, when I'd been locked in a bitter conflict with an HOA president who seemed determined to destroy me. The sculptures I created for the New Year's event were my best work yet. I did a series of pieces representing the passage of time, hourglasses, clocks, and abstract representations of moments frozen in ice. The irony wasn't lost on me. My entire conflict with Margaret had been about frozen art, about capturing something beautiful in a medium that was inherently temporary. Ice sculptures don't last. They melt, they change, they disappear. But while they exist, they can be stunning, captivating, and meaningful. In a way, that impermanence was the point. They reminded people to appreciate beauty while it lasted, to recognize that nothing stays the same forever. Margaret had tried to freeze Pinewood Estates in time, to maintain rigid control over every aspect of the community. But communities, like ice sculptures, are living things that need to change and evolve. Her attempt to prevent that change had ultimately been her downfall. On New Year's Eve, I stood in downtown Denver watching as thousands of people admired my sculptures. The pieces were lit with colored lights, creating a magical display as midnight approached. Rachel stood beside me, her face glowing with pride at the work we'd accomplished together. "This is incredible," she said. "I can't believe we created all of this." "You did most of the detailed work on the clock pieces," I reminded her. "You're becoming a real artist, Rachel." As the countdown to midnight began, I thought about the year I'd had. It had started with conflict and harassment, moved through legal battles and criminal charges, and ended with professional success and community healing. The journey had been difficult, but it had also taught me important lessons about standing up for yourself, about the importance of documentation and legal protections, and about how communities can change for the better when people are willing to fight for what's right. The crowd counted down the final seconds of the year. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Midnight arrived with cheers and fireworks. The new year had begun, and with it came new possibilities, new projects, and new opportunities. I pulled out my phone and took a photo of the crowd around my sculptures. Then I sent it to Tom Fredericks with a simple message: "Thank you for everything. Here's to a better year ahead." His response came back within minutes: "You earned it, Lucas. Happy New Year." I put my phone away and just enjoyed the moment. The ice sculptures sparkled in the lights, the crowd celebrated around me, and for the first time in a long time, I felt completely at peace. The battle with Margaret Patterson and the HOA was over. Justice had been served. And I was free to do what I loved without fear of harassment or retaliation. The sculptures would melt eventually. By morning, they'd be puddles of water. But that was okay. I'd create new ones, better ones, and the cycle would continue. That was the nature of my art, and increasingly, I realized it was the nature of life itself. Nothing stayed frozen forever, and maybe that was exactly how it should be. As January progressed, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened. The experience had changed me in ways I was still processing. I'd always been someone who avoided conflict, who tried to keep my head down and just do my work. But being forced to stand up to Margaret had taught me that sometimes you have to fight, not because you want to, but because the alternative is allowing yourself to be crushed by people who abuse their power. I'd also learned about the importance of community. During the darkest parts of the conflict, I'd felt alone and isolated. But Tom, Patricia, and others had stood by me, had supported me even when it would have been easier to stay neutral. That solidarity had made all the difference. In February, exactly 1 year after the megaphone incident, the new HOA board held a ceremony to unveil a new community monument. It was a simple stone marker in the neighborhood park, inscribed with a message about respecting individual rights while building community together. Tom gave a speech about the importance of balancing rules with flexibility, of leadership that serves rather than controls. He invited me to say a few words, which surprised me. I stood in front of the gathered neighbors, many of whom I now considered friends, and spoke from the heart. "A year ago, I was fighting just to be allowed to do my work without harassment," I said. "I felt like an outsider in my own neighborhood. Today, I feel like I'm home. That change didn't happen because I won some legal battles, though that was important. It happened because this community decided that it wanted to be better, that it wanted to be a place where people could be themselves, where differences were celebrated instead of punished, and where leadership meant service instead of control. Thank you for making that choice." The applause was genuine and warm. After the ceremony, several people approached me to share their own stories of being targeted or harassed by Margaret during her time as president. I'd thought I was the only one, or at least the worst case, but it turned out that Margaret had left a trail of victims over the years. Some had been fined for trivial violations. Others had been subjected to constant inspections and complaints, and a few had even been driven out of the neighborhood entirely. The new board was working to address those past injustices, reviewing old violations and refunding fines that had been improperly assessed. It was a slow process, but it was part of the healing that the community needed. In March, I got word that Margaret had been granted early release from jail. She'd served 8 months of her sentence and would complete the remainder on probation. She was required to continue making restitution payments to the HOA and to complete extensive community service and counseling. I never saw her again. She moved out of state, according to neighborhood gossip, starting over somewhere far from Colorado. I hoped that she'd learned from her mistakes and that she'd find a healthier path forward. But mostly, I just hoped I'd never have to deal with her again. My business continued to grow throughout the spring and summer. I took on increasingly ambitious projects, including a permanent installation at a resort in Vail that used a sophisticated refrigeration system to maintain ice sculptures year-round. It was challenging work, but exactly the kind of thing I'd dreamed about when I first got into this field. Rachel graduated from her program at UC and became my full partner in the business. We rebranded as Harrington and Associates, and she brought fresh ideas and energy that pushed us both to create better work. Together, we took on projects that I never could have handled alone. In August, I got a call from a producer at a national morning show. They'd seen coverage of my work and wanted to do a feature story about ice sculpture as an art form. The segment aired in September, and it included footage of me working in my home workshop, creating pieces in my front yard, and discussing the importance of fighting for your rights when faced with unjust authority. The producer had wanted to focus on the legal battle with Margaret and the HOA, turning it into a David versus Goliath story. I agreed to include it, but I insisted that the focus be on the art and the positive changes in the community afterward. I didn't want Margaret's legacy to define my story. She'd been an obstacle, but she hadn't been the point. The national exposure led to opportunities I'd never imagined. I was invited to create pieces for events in Chicago, New York, and Los Angeles. A gallery in San Francisco wanted to host an exhibition of my work, using advanced refrigeration to display the sculptures for an entire month. A publisher approached me about writing a book on ice sculpture techniques. Life had become busy, almost overwhelming at times. But it was a good kind of busy, the kind that comes from doing work you love and being recognized for it. Every morning, I woke up grateful that I'd stood my ground against Margaret, that I'd fought for my rights, and that I'd been part of changing my community for the better. In October, 2 years after the initial conflict began, I hosted an open house at my workshop. Neighbors, clients, and friends came through to see where the magic happened. I demonstrated some techniques, showed off my industrial freezers and sculpting tools, and answered questions about the process. Tom came through with his wife and grandchildren. The kids were fascinated by the ice, asking endless questions about how I carved it and whether it was cold to touch. I let them watch as I worked on a small piece, showing them how the tools shaped the ice and how light played through the finished sculpture. "You've come a long way," Tom said quietly while the kids were distracted by a finished eagle sculpture. "Not just the business, but you personally. You're more confident, more engaged with the neighborhood. It's good to see." "I had to learn to stand up for myself," I replied. "Margaret did me a favor in a weird way. She forced me to find my spine. She forced a lot of us to find our spines. This whole neighborhood is better because people finally said enough was enough." As the evening wound down and the last visitors left, I stood in my workshop surrounded by the tools of my trade. The industrial freezers hummed quietly, maintaining the precise temperature needed to keep my works in progress from melting. Blocks of ice waited to be transformed into art. Sketches and plans for future projects covered my workbench. This was my space, my business, my life. And I'd fought hard to protect it. The battle with Margaret Patterson and the HOA felt like it belonged to a different era now, even though it had only been 2 years. So much had changed, both in my external circumstances and in who I was as a person. I'd learned that sometimes you have to fight, even when you'd rather avoid conflict. I'd learned that documentation and legal protections matter, that you can't always rely on people being reasonable. I'd learned that community can be a source of strength when the right people step up. And I'd learned that standing up to bullies, whether they're individuals or institutions, is worth doing even when it's hard and scary. The ice sculptures that had started this whole saga were long since melted. The water they became absorbed into the ground or evaporated into the air. But the impact of that conflict lived on in positive ways. A corrupt HOA board had been removed. A community had reformed itself. And I'd built a successful business on my own terms, without compromising my principles or my rights. As I locked up the workshop for the night, I looked up at the stars over Greenfield, Colorado. They were the same stars that had been there 2 years ago when this all started, unchanging and eternal. But everything beneath them had transformed. Life moved forward, communities evolved, and people changed. The key was making sure that change moved in the right direction, toward justice and freedom rather than tyranny and control. I went inside my house, the house I'd fought so hard to keep on my own terms, and felt genuinely at home for the first time since I'd moved to Pinewood Estates. The battle was over. The war had been won. And the future stretched out ahead of me, full of possibility and promise, like a fresh block of ice waiting to be carved into something beautiful.